Hi, let me talk now about the different exchange rate regimes and the implications they have in the central bank accounts. So the central bank has three very important accounts that in their balance sheet that I want to emphasize. I mean, there are other accounts, but truly this is where all the action takes place. One of the accounts is the money that they have actually printed, and those are the currencies and the coupons that we have in our hands. So the piece of paper that we have in our hands is an asset for us, which means it's a liability for the central bank. So in the case of Mexico, these are the pesos that we have, okay? These are all in pesos. Now, the central bank has two types of assets. One is what is called international reserves, and that's, for example, the gold that the central bank has, or the currencies of other countries. So, for example, dollars. So in the case of the central bank in Mexico, they actually have a lot of dollars in their reserves, international reserves. And the idea is that this is kind of the collateral of the domestic peso. So that's they are working in that way. Domestic credit is the lending that the central bank provides to all the agents in the economy. So this includes, for example, the public sector. So when they buy a treasury bond, truly what the central bank is doing is that they are lending money to the treasury. So it is a liability of the treasury, which is an asset of the central bank. So I just want to first highlight something that we have said before, but I want to re-emphasize it. The balance sheet of the central bank is kind of independent of the balance sheet of the government. The government has a balance sheet, and for them, when they issue debt, that's a liability for them. When the central bank purchases that, they're buying that, and that becomes an asset for the central bank, in the same way that it will be an asset for all of us. So the domestic credit for the public sector is a very important piece of this. And another important piece of the central bank is the private sector. When they lend directly to banks, for example, or they provide guarantees or discounts, what they are doing is they are buying assets from the private sector, and they usually print coupons for that. If you remember our babysitter cooperative, these are kind of the transactions that we discussed at the time. So now, exchange rate regimes is the relationship that we will have between our pesos and the dollars in our international reserves. Usually domestic credit is all in pesos. Okay, so we lend in pesos to the government and we lend in pesos to the private sector. And let's assume that the gold is just a small piece, so the international reserves will be mostly dollars. Okay, so how does a currency board works? So a currency board works is a very high degree of credibility. So let's assume that we say 10 pesos is equal to $1 US, okay? And one way to achieve that is we said, well, let's assume that I have $100 billion in reserves. That would be a lot, okay? Just for the record, I mean, but let's assume we have $100 billion on reserves, and I have, on the other hand, 1,000 billion pesos on the right hand side, and I have zero domestic credit. This balance sheet actually matches in dollars. They all have 100 on both sides. Furthermore, you can ask the question, does every peso has a dime on dollars? The answer will be yes, 1 to 1. And what a currency board says is that they are now kind of restrict the ability of the central bank to issue or purchase any domestic credit. So they will not provide any domestic credit at all. So in practice, what occurs is that a currency board, what it does is that it puts restrictions on what you can do on this account. And they say this account has to be at zero at all times. So domestic credit has to be zero at all times. And what that implies is that every transaction of the central bank will happen between dollars and pesos. And because there's a promise that 10 pesos is a dollar, and every 10 pesos there is a dollar, then you can see that in these transactions, there will always happen 10 to 1. There will be no impact whatsoever in the currency. The central bank has $1 for every 10 pesos. There's no problem of credibility. Nothing will affect the credibility of the peso. Every 10 pesos, you have a dollar. The central bank is willing to do that exchange, and therefore you have assurance that exchange rate will be honored. And this is the purchase of credibility that a currency board has. If you believe the law, if you believe that the central bank will actually respect domestic credit equal to zero, then you know that 10 pesos will always be $1 in the central bank, and you can always trade with the central bank. I mean, not we directly, but we through banks, we trade directly with the central bank, and therefore the exchange rate between the peso and the dollar will be 10, period. No movement there. Let's look at how the flexible regime works. In the case of a flexible regime, what we do is we fix a different account. So let's go back to the 101,000. So again, let's assume that right now we have 10 pesos equals $1 US, okay? So we have $100 on reserves, we have 1,000 pesos on money, and we have 0 on domestic credit. A purely flexible exchange rate regime, what we say is that the reserves cannot move. What we actually specify is that there cannot be any exchange rate intervention. The central bank cannot buy or sell dollars, period. Remember, this is Mexico. So the purely flexible is that the central bank commits itself to keep the value of that collateral constant. They said, well, I'm not gonna touch the reserves. So guess what happens in this world is that depending on what occurs to the money supply, we will have an impact on the exchange rate. Let me do a transaction just for the sake of an example. Right now, I have 10 pesos for $1, so you will assume, well, the exchange rate makes sense to be 10 to 1. Now let's assume that the central bank purchases 100 billion pesos in treasury bonds, okay? And in order to do that, they printed 100 billion pesos. So now we have 11 billion pesos in the money, we have 100 billion pesos in the central bank, and 100 in US dollars. So you can imagine that now not every 10 pesos have a dollar. Truly they don't. There's this different ratio. And therefore, in some sense, what is going to happen now is that the exchange rate will deviate from 10 to 1. It will not be 11 to 1, but it will deviate from 10 to 1. For sure, it will be more. It will be 10.25. Furthermore, if you anticipate that they're going to issue 100, they're going to purchase 100 more treasury bonds, and that will imply that 100 more pesos will be printed. In anticipation to that, you might want to devalue the currency because you know that there are too many pesos for the amount of dollars that you have in the economy. And therefore, in some sense, there's a mismatch. So you are increasing the supply of pesos without increasing the supply of dollars. That cannot happen in a currency board, you see? In a currency board, let me go back to the currency board. In a currency board, if I increase 100 billions in dollars, then I have to purchase 100 billion in pesos. They will always go one in hand. In fact, if people want to sell pesos, they will bring, let's say, 200 billion in pesos to sell. Well, then I'll give you 20 billion in dollars because it's 10 to 1. So you see, in the case of the currency board, the reserves and the money supply, they're moving in tandem. They're perfectly correlated. In the case of a flexible exchange rate, what happens is that these two guys are the ones that are moving in tandem. The amount of reserves remains constant. In the fixed rate, let's start from this original point. Initial point, we have $100 billion, 1,000 billion pesos, 0 on domestic credit. So the fixed rate starts the same as a currency board, except that now there's no law. There's no law about domestic currency. You can do whatever you want. So imagine that we have a crisis. And when the crisis occurs, suddenly the central bank decides to go and support either the government or a bank. If that's the case, let's assume that they purchase 100 in treasury bonds. These are in pesos. And what I do is that I print 100 billion pesos in currency. Now, clearly there's a mismatch. clearly. But can the central bank honor the promise 10 pesos equals to $1? Well, yes, for the first 1 trillion pesos. Indeed it can. Not for all the 1100, but for the 1000 it certainly can. So therefore, what a fixed exchange rate regime does is try to buy some flexibility that in the case of the crisis, the central bank can issue and print money. They can actually do that. Now, in the process of printing, they are deteriorating their credibility. In the initial state, the promise 10 to 1 was very credible. Now that I've printed 100, this is less credible. Assume that you continue doing this for many months, and you print another 900 treasury bonds, and you print 900 billion pesos. Well, now you have 2,000 billion pesos to $100 billion. Well, that promise that is 10 to 1 is less credible. In other words, it's only credible for half of the money supply that you have outside in the economy. And what occurs in the process is that every time you use domestic credit with a fixed rate, you are deteriorating the credibility of your currency. They signal what the central bank wants to do, signals what the central bank wants to avoid, signals what type of promise the central bank is willing to uphold, which promises they are willing to, kind of violate. And therefore, in the end, the announcement of the exchange rate regime is a very important piece of information for the markets. See you in the next video.